if, Dr. Robert, you could talk about the book, what motivated you to write it, what was it based on, because we have discussed there was an earlier book written by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, which was also a non-Muslim's account of early Islam, and Dr. Robert's book is sort of based on that. So what was your book about and how is it different from it?
Yeah, thank you. I start with a historiographical problem in my book. Really, it's how do we write about the rise of Islam? You might think that's very easy. We have lots of histories written in Arabic. For a historian, there's a problem there. The first tangible Arabic historical book that we have that we could pick up and hold is only from 840 AD. So it's 210 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. A lot of things happened in that time, the Arab conquests, a new empire established, first in Damascus, they moved to Baghdad. So how do we know that what we're being told 210 years later is a real verifiable account of what actually was happening in the early years? Usually when there's a lot of dramatic changes, history gets rewritten to suit the new situation. My supervisor, Patricia Crone, who's at the Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, wrote a rather sensational book with Michael Cook, then a professor in London, called Hagerism, the Making of the Islamic World. And they took a number of contemporary Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian accounts, written in the 7th century, some of them written at the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the Arab conquests. And they came up with a very different narrative, a very different explanation and account of the rise of Islam to what we find in the Islamic sources. If that was done today, it would actually cause a big stir, because it was done in the 1970s when no one was particularly worried about that, and also, I suppose for the Muslim world, they weren't feeling a bit, on the back foot, pressurized by the West to conform to a certain type of, behavior. So no one was worried about it. There weren't actually any demonstrations about it at all, even though they said that Muhammad was a Jew, for example. No problem at all in the 70s. So my first question in the book was, can we actually trust these non-Muslim sources anymore? We say yes, or they say in the book that you can't trust the Muslim sources, but how do we know they are, just because they're earlier, that we could trust these Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian sources? They are giving a different perspective, but equally they're outsiders. They weren't insiders to the Muslim community. They weren't part of, the Prophet Muhammad's group and so on. So my first aim was to evaluate these sources for their reliability, their perspective, and the genuineness of the information they're telling us. There is certainly a value to them for the fact that they are contemporary. So they could give us insights that the later Muslim sources couldn't give. In particular, because the Muslim sources from the 9th century were mainly interested just to reconstruct the history of their own community, the Muslim community. And so the world around them wasn't of interest to them. So the conquered people, they have no interest in them. So on the positive side, the Christian sources can tell us about the Christians in the 7th century, the Jewish sources about the Jews in the 7th century, and so on. So there are value for painting a broader context, the world of the 7th century that Islam arose in. The other aspect that's kind of useful from these sources is it tells us about how the Muslim conquerors established a kind of modus vivendi, a way to live in symbiosis with the conquered people, with the Jews, the Christians, and the Zoroastrians. In the beginning, while they're conquerors, they're not that interested. But gradually, they stop being military conquerors and they become civilians. They become shopkeepers, scholars, administrators, and so on. And then they need to be able to live with the conquered subjects, with the non-Muslim peoples. And this is interesting because actually the system they evolved is still used today in many Muslim countries, particularly those that have a more stricter application of Islam, like Saudi Arabia, for example.